Greetings, I'm the Bulgarian Crocodile. Today I'm gonna talk about directors that I didn't get immediately but now love. There are four of these directors, and then there are two extra picks, and those extra picks are two directors that I've started to like more and more, but I'm still not sure whether I absolutely love their work overall. We'll see in the future. But we are gonna start with Robert Bresson, who is now one of my top 10 favorite directors of all time, which would have been hard to believe back in 2018 when I got into his work for the first time. So I started with his film Pickpocket, which is one of his more famous works and one of his more highly acclaimed works, but I couldn't get into it at all. Back then, I was into really kind of maximalist cinema. Back then, Stanley Kubrick was my favorite director of all time, and I feel like everything I watched, I kind of compared to Kubrick, and I love the kind of very maximalist style of Kubrick, how had this very kind of grand, he had this very grand vision on his films, like in 2001: A Space Odyssey, and yeah, every shot was so well thought out, and all the details were perfect, and his films just had such a huge scope to them. So I love that type of cinema back then, when I had some trouble with more minimalist type of cinema, more simple cinema. But now that I've gotten older, I actually often love the simple and minimalist stuff more than I do the more grandiose, bigger picture type of stuff. Although I still love Kubrick, as you know. But yeah, I watched the Pickpocket and couldn't really get into it, although I didn't hate it or anything, but it just left me cold. And that summer, because I watched it in the summer of 2018, I was really alienated by French cinema in general. I watched quite a lot of classic cinema during that summer, and especially classic French cinema. But most of the French cinema that I watched then, I couldn't kind of get into. So I just found it emotionally so cold that I couldn't kind of personally connect to it that well, which is kind of weird now in retrospect, because these days I, of course, really love French cinema. France is my second favorite country for cinema after Japan, and I especially love the French New Wave stuff that I had struggled to get into back in the day. Like the only French films that I really loved that summer was the Emperors of Cherbourg, because that's obviously a very emotional film and quite different from other new wave films. But yeah, I had lots of trouble with Bresson then, and then the second Bresson film I watched was L'Argent, which I liked a bit more than Pickpocket, but I still didn't love it that much. And by the way, now I have rewatched both of those films and like them a lot, although they still aren't my favorite Bresson films, but I really appreciate those films. And sometimes these things can be up to kind of your choice on like what films you start with. Yeah, I feel like maybe if I started with um, A Man Escaped with Bresson, maybe I could have gotten into him quicker. Or if I started with Four Nights of a Dreamer, maybe I could have gotten into him quicker. It's really hard to say. And maybe I would have been alienated by those films as well back then, but who knows? But yeah, it really can come down to your choice of first films that you watch from a director. Yeah. But then after L'Argent, I watched Mouchette, and that one I liked quite a bit more, and that one I could connect to emotionally. And then after I had watched that, I became a bit more um, optimistic about my relationship with Bresson's work. And then I think after that I watched Oh Hazard Balthazar, and that actually kind of blew me away immediately. Although there were kind of little gaps between these watches, so obviously back then I grew as a cinephile very quickly because I was constantly consuming these classics. I was learning a lot, like from like every month, and like my taste changed quite quickly, and I learned to appreciate more styles than I had before quite quickly. So yeah, I feel like as I just grew as a cinephile in general, it was easier for me to connect to some of these works. Yeah. And then a few years ago, I completed Bresson's filmography. I've watched all of his films and I've also rewatched many of them. And now he's one of my top 10 filmmakers, like I said. And I absolutely love his simple style, or even you could say the lack of style. And now I love so many of these films that we have here on this page. Like I love A Man Escaped, I love Au Hazard Balthazar, I love Mouchette, I love Diary of a Country Priest. I really need to rewatch that one. I love Four Nights of a Dreamer. Lancelot du Lac is great, and I think all of these feature films here are at least good. Again, this silent film, Le Affaire Public, or however you pronounce that, yet that this is not that good. But even Angels of Sin, which is his first um, feature film, is like a pretty good film, and then obviously these are also good, and yeah. But he made so many great films, and I think he's in the conversation for being the greatest filmmaker ever for me, and again one of my absolute favorites. But yeah, his style was really hard for me to get into. Yeah, and Bresson is also a good example of a director whose films are kind of deceptively simple. That you think that, oh yeah, this is such a simple plot. It doesn't really say anything about anything, but then there is actually lots of substance there under the surface. Just when you get comfortable with his style, which can be quite hard at first, especially like in today's age when everything is so intense and quick. So it's hard to get into this kind of minimalist stuff where there isn't that much on the surface. Yeah. But yeah, Bresson is kind of the definition of this topic for me. But anyway, let's move on. So then we have Kenji Mizoguchi, who is now one of my absolute favorite Japanese filmmakers. But it was a bit hard for me to get into his works. At first, I started with Sancho the Bailiff. Back then, I was a complete kind of novice cinephile. I had just gotten into world cinema and Japanese cinema. I had probably maybe watched maybe 10 Japanese films or maybe even less when I watched Sancho the Bailiff for the first time. And I liked the film, and the ending I actually connected to very much on my first watch back then, but the whole film I couldn't kind of get why it was so highly regarded, even though again I liked it. Then I watched Yugetsu maybe a year later. I liked that a bit more, but still didn't like fully love it. And then in the next couple of years after that, I watched a couple of his films. Yeah, couldn't get into all of them. But then eventually, as few years went by, I watched, I think again, The Life of Oharu and The Crucified Lovers. Those films I really loved. And Street of Shame was one that I also really enjoyed. And then only like a couple of years ago, I rewatched Sancho the Bailiff, and that rewatch changed my mind on the film completely. Of course, I've now championed the film a lot on my channel, and I've said that it's in the conversation for being the greatest film of all time. I think it's just so good. But I think what alienated me from his work at first was maybe just how depressing his films are. They are very political, they are all about again, social issues. There isn't much kind of traditional entertainment value there. And in many ways, they feel like films of their time. So, of course, at first it was hard for me to get into the kind of pacing of the 40s, 50s films and black and white films. And yeah, they didn't kind of click with me immediately. But now I just absolutely love Mizoguchi's work. There's so much substance there. They are still relevant in many ways, especially in a patriarchal society like Japan. And I also now absolutely love his visual style, again, the framing of the shots and the contrast in the black and white and everything is just absolutely perfect. Yeah. And of course, he's one of the big three filmmakers. Kurosawa was the easiest for me to get into, and Ozu was really easy for me to get into, which might be quite surprising as he's a director that kind of, yeah, again, doesn't really fit the current times in the way how kind of slow his films are, and they are just about kind of normal people having conversations about daughters like having arranged marriages and stuff like that. So there's not that much kind of what we would call excitement, but for some reason I really got into Ozu's work very easily. And of course he's one of my top five directors now. And Kenji Mizoguchi is probably like one of the top 15 directors for me. And he has a pretty big filmography, so I feel like I still might put him even higher on my list once I've been able to watch more of these films and also rewatch more of them. Yeah. But yeah, I absolutely love Mizoguchi. Now he's one of the goats, and yeah, it doesn't really get better than his best films. So yeah, great director. And then we have the Greek master Theo Angelopoulos. We will talk about one of his films in the next podcast, so look out for that. We will talk about Eternity and a Day, one of his best films in my opinion. But I started going through Angelopoulos' work, I think in maybe 2020, around the early pandemic days, and I started in a chronological order. So I started with his again 70s work. So there are like a couple of films before he made the Traveling Players. So there's the Reconstruction from 1970, and then there is what's the other one? Oh yeah, Days of 36. So those I thought were like pretty good, but didn't really love them. Then I watched the Traveling Players, which sometimes is his kind of most acclaimed film in the critical circles. But I again thought that it was a good film, but I just didn't feel anything when I watched it. And then I took a bit of a break from his films after I had seen the Traveling Players, as I thought that I wasn't that into his films. His films felt too kind of political to me. Obviously, I like political cinema, and again, all cinema is political in some way or another, but it felt like his films were all about that they were very didactic, that they were just trying to make a point, and there wasn't much else there. But then once I started getting into his bit later work from the 80s and 90s, I noticed that, oh, I actually love this stuff. And I feel like there's a bit of a contrast between his 80s, 90s work in comparison to his 70s work. That to me, the 70s work to me was a bit more, again, didactic and dry. And his later work that is a bit more, I think, hypnotic, and I could say maybe artistic. Yeah, in a way. Although I really need to return to his 70s work, and one of the 70s works that I actually liked more is the one that came after the Traveling Players, which is this one called The Hunters. Yeah, but yeah, this is a good example of a case where maybe if I started with something like Eternity and a Day and Ulysses Case, I might have gotten into his work immediately. But because I started with the early stuff, I had trouble with his films. Yeah, but then I again, once I kind of got into him again and started watching his 80s and 90s stuff, I actually completed his filmography very quickly and watched all of his features. And then I think again, yeah, I've watched these shorts as well, or I think this isn't a short, but I mean, it's quite short compared to his long films, but I don't think it's like an officially a short film. And then these two I think aren't available anywhere, so I haven't seen them. And then there are these, I think, like kind of collection works that were like many directors made. So I haven't seen those, but I've basically seen everything that he made that is available. So you can see here 16 out of 20. So again, I kind of binged watch most of his filmography quite quickly, and then I really grew to love him a lot. And again, some of the works that blew me away the most again were Eternity and a Day, then Ulysses Gaze, The Weeping Meadow, and then Alexander the Great, that came out 1980, so just after his 70s work that I struggled with. Then The Beekeeper is really good. And I think this would be actually a pretty good introduction to his work, um, because it's a bit shorter. It has a kind of nice, simple plot to it. It has the great Marcello Mastroianni in the lead role, and Yeah, great movie. And this is actually another one that I struggled with, Landscape in the Mist, which is one of his most famous films, if not his most famous. So really need to return to that one as well. Voyage to Sutera I liked quite a lot. And this one also, the suspended step of the stork, I liked quite a lot. Yeah, The Dust of Time, I think is one of his weakest ones. That was that his last film, maybe. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, but yeah, I really need to go back to many of these films and see how I like them on a rewatch. Both again the films that I have loved, but also the films that I didn't like as much. But again, to sum it up, I think the fact that I found these films to be like very kind of overtly political and very didactic in their politics, that was kind of the thing that put me off of them. Although I kind of noticed again later on that that was the case mostly with the 70s stuff and not necessarily with all his stuff, even though all of his stuff is very political. Yeah. But anyway, a great filmmaker, and excited to talk about Eternity and a Day in the podcast. It will be a very challenging discussion as Angelopoulos is a very challenging filmmaker. Yeah. Then this might be quite surprising unless you've watched lots of my videos. So we have Hayao Miyazaki. Obviously, his films are quite accessible, but I actually only watched one of his films as a kid, which was My Neighbor Totoro. And as a kid, I wasn't that big of a fan of it because as a kid, I preferred kind of very action-packed stuff like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Dragon Ball and Pokemon and Digimon and things like that. I've actually been in the mood to rewatch Digimon lately. Yeah. Anyway. Uh, yeah, so then I got started getting into his again famous films. I think in my late teens, so I think I started with Spirited Away and Princess Mononoke. And again, I liked them and appreciated them. Again, the beautiful visuals and everything, the great uh, soundtracks, but I just didn't kind of completely get the hype for them, and I didn't get like why these are the best animated films of all time. But then when I watched Kiki's Delivery Service and rewatched My Neighbor Totoro, I kind of really then that was the point when I really got him, and I got why his work is so special. And then I also watched Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, and that the one I thought was absolutely amazing as well. And then in retrospect, when I've thought about Spirited Away and Princess Mononoke, I've realized how special those films are as well, and I really need to rewatch those. And yeah, Castle in the Sky also really good. The Wind Rises didn't connect with me personally, but I thought it was still quite good. And House Moving Castle is really good. Ponyo was pretty good, but maybe my least favorite one. Then Porco Rosso I watched quite recently, which was really good, but I haven't seen all these like very early ones yet. And then I haven't seen the new one, The Boy and the Heron. But I think the kind of what I didn't get what I didn't like at first was just the type of stories that he did. Again, I want that bit more intense type of animated stories with lots of action and stuff. Of course, many of these are kind of adventure films, and they have lots of kind of more action-packed moments in them. But I want that Dragon Ball type of stuff. And yeah, and I also think the fact that I didn't watch these as a kid, other than again My Neighbor Totoro, that probably affected my enjoyment. I think maybe if I watched many of these as a kid, I could have gotten into his work quicker, even though again as a kid I was more into that action-packed animated stuff. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, okay. One of the criticisms that I still have for like Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli in general is kind of how like overly similar the animation is in every film. Of course, the animation is gorgeous. I'm not saying that it isn't, but it feels like the main characters always look the same in every film and stuff like that. So they don't kind of separate themselves that much due to that the characters always feel the same no matter which film you watch. Although that's a very minor criticism, but that's something that I sometimes think about. Yeah, but yeah, these are great children's films, and they work as really well as an adult as well. Like way better than I think Pixar films than Disney films do. Yeah, but anyway, great filmmaker. Then we have the two extra picks. So we have Louis Buñuel, who I really struggled with a lot when I first got into him. Although again, I've noticed with him that the more and more I watch, the more and more I enjoy his films. Yeah. For example, The Exterminating Angel, when I first watched it, I didn't like it that much. But then when I rewatched it, it became a all-time favorite for me. So I feel like that will kind of happen with many of these films that when I kind of go back to them, I will love them more. And again, films like The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, The Phantom of Liberty, The Obscure Object of Desire are films that I really liked already on my first watch, and I feel like on a rewatch I will probably like them even more. And then Los Olvidados was a film that it kind of used to be my favorite Buñuel film before I rewatched The Exterminating Angel, so I feel like Los Olvidados is probably a film that I'm gonna love a lot still when I rewatch it, and it might become an all-time favorite. And then Viridiana is probably a film that I will like more when I rewatch it as well. But yeah, I'm not sure why it was hard for me to got into Buñuel at first. I think there was a time in my life when I was kind of bored of the let's make fun of the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie type of films, but I'm not bored of those anymore. I like that type of social critique and class critique, one could say now, but there was a time when I thought that it wasn't that interesting, especially as there are so many kind of art house filmmakers that have done that type of stuff. Yeah, Jean Renoir's La Règle de Jeu comes to mind, for example, with that topic. But yeah, so that was maybe one of the reasons, and I also think that his visual style has never connected with me completely, because it's good, and I think it's kind of has flashes of brilliance, and it's so close to being something that I love, but there's just something missing there. I don't know if I can articulate what that is, and it's not the case with every one of his films, but with some of them it is. Yeah, but yeah, again, like I said, he has grown on my estimation like throughout the years, and again, I feel like in 5 years or even maybe way earlier than that, he might be one of my favorites. But I really need to start rewatching more of these films. Yeah, and I've seen 13 out of 33, so I still also have many of these kind of more lesser known ones to watch. Yeah, and the biggest one that I haven't seen yet is probably L, which I've heard is really good, and I think my good friend Tony loves this one, Land Without Bread, which is it is a short film. Yeah, I think like 30 minutes long or something. But then the other extra big is Wong Kar-Wai, and I started getting into him like very early on in my cinephile journey, in my first like half a year as a cinephile, basically. Um, and I started with Chunking Express and In the Mood for Love, and Chunking Express I didn't get at all, and I still haven't rewatched it, but I need to. I feel like I will at least like it more now. Then In the Mood for Love I liked, but again didn't love as much as many people do, and still need to rewatch that too. But then later on, oh wait, so I watched Ashes of Time a bit after that, and I didn't like that one at all. But then a bit later on, I watched Fallen Angels, which I liked a lot more. I think that's a really great film. Then I watched Happy Together, and then I also rewatched Happy Together, and that became an all-time favorite for me. I absolutely love that film. And then I watched 2046, which I also think is a masterpiece. It's so good. And I think now that I love 2046, I feel like I will laugh in the mood for love when I decide to rewatch it. So again, this is a case of again the first few films that I watched from him. I wasn't blown away, but then later on I got into some of his other films and then I was blown away by those. So I feel like, okay, once I do some rewatching, he might become one of my favorites, or if he doesn't become a favorite, at least a very near favorite. And I still need to watch Days of Being Wild and As Years Go By, and hopefully I will like those ones a lot. And this one I also, these two I haven't watched either, The Grandmaster and My Blueberry Nights, but I think people don't usually really talk about those, but I think As Years Go By and Days of Being Wild should be good at least. And then there are these other ones. I think many of these are short films here that I need to rewatch or not rewatch but watch. Yeah. But I've always thought that Wong Kar-Wai is very much against style over substance, and that's not always a problem for me. There are films that I love purely based on the aesthetics, but then sometimes it bothers me that if there's nothing more going on. But I feel like as I've again watched more of them, I've noticed that yeah, maybe they are bit style over substance, but I think there is still substance in there too. But yeah, we'll see how my Wong Kar-Wai journey keeps on developing. But anyway, those were the directors. Let me know what you think of these six directors here. And let me know if you have any directors that didn't click with you immediately, but then as time went on, you started loving them. I think this is a pretty interesting topic on how our taste changes. Although, of course, I know there are kind of, you could say, roughly two type of personality types. There are those ones who have a very set taste very early on, and their taste doesn't really evolve as they get older. But then there are people like me who still keep developing and their taste keeps on evolving even as an adult. So yeah. But anyway, let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching. Don't drink Coke at all. Sayonara and arigato gozaimashita.